Hello students, it's Dr. Winkler again. I hope wherever you're at, you're having a great day, and I hope it continues to be that way. This is the fourth lecture from my History 151G Modern Civilizations course. Hopefully everything is going well for you and you're understanding everything quite nicely. I invite you to follow along with the study guide. As you can see, I believe I am on page 3 near the bottom. Hopefully you've printed this off or have easy access to it from the Canvas system. Discussing the Reformation. I make a big deal over the Reformation. I think it's one of the more significant advances, occurrences, if you will, in the entire scope of modern history, and influences societies for a very lengthy period of time, including today. Well, I was talking about some issues, the issues in the spread of the Reformation. I talked about the Anabaptists being baptized again. Remember, these are fundamentalist Christians who, by contemporary standards, even later standards, take a look at the Bible and go, well, let's be more literalist. And they, shall we say, begin institutions like polygamy, apostles, prophets, that are unacceptable both to the Protestant and Catholic camps. And remember, they're crushed by both Protestants and Catholics alike, though vestiges do survive. Another issue in the, let's get you right here, in the early spread of the Reformation becomes a social and political issue. And let's talk briefly about the Peasants' War. The peasants have been working for the last couple hundred years to make themselves free. This is true of a lot of places of Europe. But let's focus on what's happening in Germany. The peasants have been making steady progress. Throughout much of the Middle Ages, these people are controlled in an institution we call serfdom. Serfdom is simply where you are controlled by the landlord. You're not completely free, you're not completely unfree. You do have some rights, but you are tied to the land. You have to pay certain feudal dues. You have to do certain service, sometimes working for the landlord. Over the centuries, the German peasants have been able to gain their freedom. It's a fairly lengthy process. Plague is involved, military action is involved, inflation is involved. All of these things allow the peasants to get more freedom. In fact, most of the peasants in Germany are free by this time frame. But let's take a look at what's happened. Remember the Renaissance? The Renaissance wants to be a throwback to that which is Greek and Roman. While Roman law is known in the Middle Ages, largely through church law, the church has a tendency during the Middle Ages to take a look at Roman law and say, this is pretty good, so we'll alter that for our purposes in church law. We call this canon law. But other people are looking at Roman law in a whole new light. You see, can we say that it was common law that the peasants were able to work to their advantage? But when Roman law is re-emphasized and reintroduced, you see, Roman law is good law. It is very good law. It's codified, it's logical, but it's very good law if you're upper class. Roman law does not favor the lower classes. In fact, in some of the statements in Roman law, you cannot take a deposition from a lower class person, that includes slaves, unless the admission was taken under torture. Obviously, that's a very big problem for these people. Do you want to be tortured? Of course not. When the upper classes see Roman law, they say, well, we can take the common law and say that's inferior law. And now we can take Roman law and place that on top of or shall we say, virtually replacing common law. And now Roman law will allow us to control the peasants ever so much more forcefully. In other words, we can push them back to, more or less back towards serfdom and away from the freedoms that they've been gaining for a long time. This hurts. See, suddenly when the peasants have been arguing in courts, we have these rights, and the judges and lawyers come forward and say, wait a minute, we have Roman law says that you don't have these rights. The peasants are also restive. They're prone to violence at times. Remember I said one of the factors in the peasants gaining their freedom, going from serfdom to freedom, was their ability to force issues. Not just legally, but sometimes, shall we say, taking it to the streets. Well, the peasants are concerned because they're losing rights, not gaining them. And the peasants, let's look right here, they look to Luther's doctrines. You see, doesn't Luther do away with the church hierarchy? No longer do you have to have a lineal authority. Remember the invisible church? You have true believers, then the priesthood is actually the power of the church is actually among them. Is this not actually saying we have an equality of peoples? That social classes, at least by Luther's theology, should not be there, that everybody should be equal? Wow, isn't this nice? Can the peasants go to Luther's doctrines and say, oh, by the way, let's say that we are equal? Well, there's a problem. Luther doesn't like this. He does not want his doctrines to be used to further the aspirations of the lower classes. Well, the Peasants' War. As you can see, the Peasant War breaks out in 1524. The peasants rebel against their feudal leaders. I believe the actual outbreak started when a wealthy woman decided, well, I want to have mushrooms for dinner. So she orders her peasants to go out in the forest and pick me mushrooms. The reasons why the peasants don't like this is it's harvest time. And they've got to bring in their harvest, so it's going to be pretty bad for them. This leads to confrontations. It leads to violence. And we see the peasants, largely in southern Germany, sweeping large areas, attacking the upper classes. Of course, the upper classes are responding. They're bringing out what I call the hired guns, the knights, to suppress the lower classes. See if I can get you a map or two. It's a pretty bloody affair. Depending on which source you want to read, which study, the number of peasants that are killed is probably about 100,000. I hope that's an exaggeration. Violence. One of the problems sometimes when we look at etchings from this time frame, or woodcuts, the artists do have a tendency to put a lot of action in a small place. I want to, excuse me, I want to give you a sense of where these rebellions took place. Essentially, it's southern Germany, what you and I would call Bavaria, Swabia, and these areas. You can see this is an area of what you and I would call southern and central Germany, right in here. Switzerland would be about down here, and southern Germany up in this area. Well, the affair is very ugly. The peasants are really at an extreme disadvantage. They're peasants. The knights, these men that are hired to take them out, these are professional soldiers. They have better armor, they have better organization, they have better weaponry. So on the basis of this, it seems like the peasants are going to lose. But they do appeal, not just to Martin Luther's doctrines, they appeal directly to him. Now remember, Luther's not upper class. He's not a peasant either. His background is middle class, as I mentioned earlier. His father was a miner. On the basis of that, you would think, well, maybe he'd have a little bit more leanings toward the peasantry. That's not the case at all. In reality, he essentially throws his lot over, at least his lot over to the upper classes. There are authors that say that because Martin Luther refused to support these people, that led to their defeat and their destruction. I don't think that's true at all. I think these people's fate was sealed as soon as the nobles started bringing out their henchmen to do their dirty work for them. Unfortunately, Luther wrote a tract. It's called Against, I have it right here, Against the Murdering, Thieving Hordes of Peasants. See, Luther wants them killed. Didn't just keep his mouth shut. He wrote this pamphlet in which he's saying you should kill these people. Now remember, by this time frame, he had very clearly defined his doctrine, that there's nothing you can do as a person to gain your salvation. It is a gift of God. But can we say he alters his doctrine a little bit? This attack is not just cheering on the knights and the henchmen of the nobles. This is a change in his doctrine. He actually goes so far as to state and suggest that if you go out and you kill a peasant, this can be very good for your salvation. Well, as I mentioned already, the peasants really didn't have a chance. They're just simply outmanned, outgunned, and they are repressed very bloodily. The peasants are crushed. Now, one of the reasons why I tried to give you a sense of where the rebellions took place is that in talking about southern Germany, as you surely know, many of you know anyway, that even today the divide between religion in Germany is largely, not entirely, but largely north-south. There is the stretches of northern Germany up in this area are Protestant. Large sections, places like Bavaria, down here are Catholic. Remember, it was the southern areas where the peasants revolted. It was the southern areas where Martin Luther said these people should be killed. It is these southern areas that thought that they were betrayed not only by Luther's doctrines, but by Luther himself. See, there's no chance that southern Germany was ever going to go Lutheran. There's no chance that southern Germany would ever try to embrace Luther and his teachings after this time frame. And as I've mentioned, they're Catholic even today. Now, in all fairness to Luther, what's at stake here? Let me make something quite clear. In the long run, the Protestant Reformation is only successful when it has the support of the government. It can be the city government, it can be the kingdom, it can be a principality, but it has to have support of the government. An example is Austria. Austria had a significant Protestant movement. They had large numbers of people in the lower classes, no longer giving money to the Catholic Church, no longer going to Mass. Sometimes they're a little violent, sometimes they break a few images. We can say a very large percentage of lower classes, in fact, are Protestant. But the government, the Habsburg family is ruling Austria this time frame and for hundreds of years after this time frame, virtually until World War I. They never go Protestant. They remain Catholic. With the power of the state being able to coerce and intimidate what's happening in society, they actually force the nation to remain Catholic. This is also true of Bohemia, what you and I call the Czech Republic. Large Protestant movements there. but the state never went for them. Therefore, they were forced to be Catholic. If Luther had looked like a renegade, if he looked like he was a loose cannon that is trying to defend the rights of the peasants, then the state in so many places would have came down right on top of him and right on top of his movement. This could have led to the destruction of Protestantism. However, in doing this, we see a tendency now that Luther is actually giving some of the power of the religion over to the state. My movement is not against the state. My movement is to support the state. So the state does become involved in many affairs that are dealing with religion. It is true in many places, Switzerland, Germany today, that when you declare a religion, and sometimes you have to declare a religion, they will take a small amount of tax to support your religion. Let's say you're Protestant, let's say you're Lutheran. So a small amount, I forget, it's something, 1/3% or something. They will take that and they'll give it to support your religion. Now, but you see what's happening here. You're taking money from you and it goes to the hands of the government. And the government goes over to support the religion, might pay the pastor, might maintain the buildings, all these kinds of things. But when it goes to the hands of the government, is it possible that the government really, in this case, might interfere a little bit? I mean, if your wages, if you're a priest, pastor, and your wages actually comes to the government, they can be somewhat influential on what you do. The government doesn't like what you're doing. They have means to change what you're doing. Let me bounce up several centuries. Let me go up to the Holocaust. Largely starts in Germany, as you well know, 1930s, 1940s. In retrospect, in looking at the reaction of various groups, it's surprising to me to what level Catholicism has been subject to criticism for what they did, in many cases, perhaps what they did not do. But there are other religions in Germany. In fact, numerically, I believe the Protestants actually outnumber the Catholics by something. We don't see the criticisms coming down on why did not the Lutheran Church, why did not the Reformed Church, both Protestant churches, come down against the regime? Well, it was believed, with a lot of ways of supporting this, that the Catholics still had independence of action. Therefore, they could have chosen more strongly to resist what the Nazis were doing. While the Protestants had a tendency not to have so much independence of action because they're more carefully monitored, shall we say, by the government itself. So this can have lengthy implications. Was Luther right in doing this? At some point, he probably had to give support to the state. It wouldn't have worked otherwise. On the other hand, he went way too far. He didn't have to do this. He didn't have to advocate them being killed. I believe there's one quote in there where Luther says, kill, smite, slay. Don't let your sword grow cold. Bathe it in the blood of the warm peasants. Okay? So maybe this is a little bit an overstatement, but Luther essentially does hand over the church to the state. At least he's going to make sure that the church will do what the state wants them to do. What I've been arguing about before, Reformation is only successful where the state supports it. That's true. One of the things that you say, well, what is the reason why we find people going Protestant? Remember, let's go back to Frederick III. Remember, he spent an enormous amount of money buying relics in Saxony. though he and Martin Luther never even met. He supports Lutheranism, even though it's going to cost him a great deal of money because people aren't going to care about his relics anymore. And nobody's going to come and give a coin to help their soul by seeing a relic if that is no longer relevant. So why would he do it? I have to believe conviction. There are people that are listening to the Lutheran doctrine and says this is superior. I believe this more readily than what I've already been taught. There are times in the Reformation where there are appeals made to princes like Frederick III. There are people that are make appeals to the city councils. And we find cities voting either to remain Catholic or to go Protestant. Once again, I do believe that there are convictions involved. But on the other hand, the church is very, very wealthy. And if you go Protestant, what happens to the church property? What happens to the church gold and silver? You see, the Protestants no longer believe in going from the Catholics that icons, artifacts, a statue, maybe materials made, a chalice made out of silver or gold. This is no longer relevant because you don't have icons, things that you look at anymore. Well, what do you do with these things? You give them to the state. You're sitting in the city council and they say, okay, church owns a monastery in downtown, whatever city we're talking about. Let's vote if we're going to go Protestant or not. Oh, by the way, a lot of times this wealth ends up in the hands of the city council. So if I vote in a certain direction, I get rich. Whoa. Remember, in certain places, a lot of places in Europe, we do think a rough average of how much land is owned by the churches can be like 1/3 of all the land. And when you go Protestant, the state gets it. So this could be a factor. Okay, well, let's go back a little bit, just a little bit more. And we can make excuses. We do want to look from the standpoint of people their own time. I argued earlier in this class that we shouldn't always say, well, that's the way they did it back then, and make that an excuse. You see, if we made that excuse for Martin Luther, that's just the way he did it back then. We shouldn't judge his conduct. Well, the peasants, those tens of thousands of peasants that are slaughtered, I want to hear what they want to say about that. They might disagree. And I think they are at least as worthy of consideration as anybody else. Another way we can look at this is that there are contemporaries that disagree with this. Though you're under the same kinds of pressures and concerns, there are people that do not really agree with this. Now, I've talked about Martin Luther. In a few minutes, I'll talk about John Calvin. These are the two most important men in the Protestant Reformation. Sometimes we say Huldrych Zwingli, Swiss reformer, largely working out of Zurich, establishes the Swiss Reformed Church. It's definitely Protestant, but it's not Lutheran. Sometimes we call him the third man of the Reformation. Sure. There's another man, at least as important perhaps as Zwingli, Martin Bucer. Martin Bucer runs the Reformation in Strasbourg. This time frame is a German-speaking city. Now it's part of France, so we use the French spelling for this. While Martin Luther is saying, I want these people killed, Martin Bucer is saying, come to Strasbourg and we will feed you. Now, of course, he's not the state, but he has great influence with the city council. He does go to the city council and say, look, we've got to do something for these people. We can't turn them away. We cannot, they'll starve. They've got to have some place of refuge. So thousands come. Peasants fleeing the repression of the Knights, and they come to Strasbourg. Martin Bucer writes a letter to Luther, and among other things he said, Brother Martin, is this or is this not a gospel of love? That's pretty biting criticism, actually. Well, sometimes we call Bucer the fourth man of the Reformation. He's actually working to establish another Protestant, called Reformed. group of Protestants in Strasbourg. One of the situations with Martin Luther is this: he is so nice that he kind of agrees too much with other people. And because of this, it's his ideas tend to be kind of subsumed in ideas of people like Calvin and Zwingli. But he's worth remembering. Luther has some other very strong feelings. And Luther hates Jews. Jews have been in Germany for hundreds of years. During the Black Death, starting like in 1348, 49, 50, as a reaction to the Black Death, many cities in Germany kill their Jews. The more fortunate Jews escape. They can go over to Poland, what you and I would now call Poland, eastern parts of Germany, where they find more toleration over there. But over the 150 years, close to 2 centuries by the time frame you get to 1543, a lot of Jews had returned, and they are enclaves in many cities. Well, the Jews are really not concerned very much at all about what the Catholics and Protestants are saying. However, Luther wants them to agree with him. Luther wants them to become Christians. Luther wants them to accept his brand of Christianity and become good Protestants. The Jews are nice about this. They're not really trying to push issues. They've been approached numerous times, but they're not interested. They're more interested in maintaining their faith and their culture. There's no pressure on Luther to do this. Nobody's after him. But in 1543, he publishes yet another pamphlet called Jews and Their Lies. And he's quite vicious. He comes down on them very heavily. We should burn all of their books. The Talmud, those kind of books that the Jews revere as great teachings, they should be destroyed. Their synagogues should be destroyed and burned. Their free passes, their ability to walk and use public highways and roads, all this should be revoked. And he actually goes so far as to say they need to be eradicated. Now, in a sense, can we say that there's a lot of people at this time frame who say the same thing? He's not unique in this manner. On the other hand, there are other people that are living at the same time who say, even if they don't like the Jews particularly, say, well, at least we can tolerate them. Okay, we just let them alone, don't bother. So we cannot say that he's just following what everybody else believes, because other people believe different things. What's the impact on this? Remember, particularly in Protestant Germany, Luther has a tremendous amount of prestige. Many years ago, I was having a conversation with a woman from northern Germany. She was from the city of Hamburg. And Hamburg is one of the Lutheran areas of Germany. And she said, I've read this elsewhere, that Martin Luther was the great hero. It's like almost like a national icon for Protestant Germany. And when I was discussing these things, which I believe are somewhat questionable as to his ideas and conduct, she was surprised. She says, we were not even allowed to know anything possibly negative about him. Centuries later, there are people, we call them Nazis, that hate Jews. As you well know, we'll talk about this later in the class, about anti-Semitism and the effort to destroy entirely a religion, these people. What do you think the Nazis thought about Martin Luther and on the Jews in their lives. Look at this. One of the great thinkers in German history, in Protestant German history. Look what he says about the Jews. He lends his prestige, shall we say, to something he could not possibly foresee, because it comes several centuries later. But I have to speculate, I have to wonder, what would have been a difference had he not said this? Would there have been a difference? Maybe not. Maybe the Nazis would have just turned to somebody else. They could certainly do that. But it is unfortunate. They're able to use him and his prestige to support their vicious policies. Let's just take this up a little bit farther. There are a number of I said that wrong. There's a number of Lutheran groups. There's not just one Lutheran group. I have a good friend who's a Lutheran, and I think they call them different synods. And he was telling me about them. And he says, all those people, that other synod over there, oh boy, they're way off base. So I'm not saying every Lutheran group believes this, but let's take a look. There's one group, I know virtually nothing about them, the Evangelical Free Lutherans. In 1994, they categorically reject all of Luther's teachings on Jews because there's no way to reconcile a moral belief system on what Luther was saying. We're not quite done with Lutheranism. We're going to mention at least one of the context, but I don't want to slip past without talking about Calvinism. As I've already mentioned, there are several important reformers. The most important, Martin Luther. The next, the most important, John Calvin. John Calvin is a Frenchman. While Luther's very good, he's a German, in stirring up, shall we say, Protestantism within the German-speaking areas. He understands the culture. He speaks very well to them and their ideas. John Calvin's a Frenchman, and therefore he's going to have more insights into French culture, ideology, and his movement is going to be more popular among people in France than anything Martin Luther did, as far as influencing France is concerned. He lives in a few places. Can we get a portrait of John Calvin? I got him John Calvin. His French name would be Jean, of course. Luther was a man of a little bit of bulk. And as he got a little older, he got a little more bulkier. Calvin is a little bit different, that as time goes by, he kind of gets thinner as he ages. Geneva is now in modern Switzerland. When he moved there, it was being controlled by the Swiss Confederation. It is a French-speaking area of Switzerland. And there are, I believe, 6 cantons in modern Switzerland that speak French. 3 of those are Catholic, 3 of those are Protestant. However, one of those is clearly, Geneva itself is clearly Protestant. It is Calvinist. Why would I make a big deal over him? Most Christian churches come from Calvinism. Let me draw you a little picture. We'll come to the English Reformation shortly. But we have a Reformation in France, Geneva, ran by Calvin. When the English have their Reformation, rather than looking toward Lutheran doctrine as the matrix or the foundation of their beliefs, they look to John Calvin. So the Church of England, we'll talk about this later, the Church of England is Calvinist. And there's something that happens, like in the 17th century, call this the 1600s, where there's an explosion, a literal explosion of churches coming out of England. I mean, We remember a lot of these, perhaps the most prominent of which are the Baptists, most prominent of which are the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers, other groups as well. And at about that same time, the English are sending out colonies, including colonies to North America. So you have colonies to North America, and what do? Well, the Puritans go up to New England. They later become Congregationalists. The Puritans are Calvinists. The Congregationalists are Calvinists. The Church of England, which is prominent, George Washington's a member of the Church of England, they come over, and guess what? They are Calvinists. And we have other groups. The Baptists come to the United States. The Quakers come to the United States. They're all Calvinist. So if you look at the modern religious structure in the United States, with very few exceptions, we are seeing some Lutherans. Everybody else is largely from the Calvinist stripe. So they're very important. And not just in England, but in many places where the English go throughout the world. Very, very importantly, including the United States. So most Christian churches come from Calvinism. Well, there's a lot of similarities. There are both Protestant churches between Lutheranism and Calvinism. I don't want to sit here and talk about the similarities. Let's look about some of the different emphases that we see in Calvinism, which has a tendency to more clearly define what they're doing. There's a scripture which is important among the Calvinists. It's Matthew 5:14. And Jesus is talking, of course, and it says, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden." What would be the significance of this? Calvin believes in the Christian community. He believes that Christians as a group coming together in worship, a little bit like Luther, if you have true believers among them, manifestly encompass the Spirit of the Lord. To a certain extent, this ends up being an ethic. His ideas tend to appeal more to people living in cities, because the people in cities like to live in groups, religious people. They like to worship together. I mean, he believes that when you're choosing a pastor, for example, you simply turn to the people in the community. Remember, if there's few true believers there, the Spirit of the Lord is manifestly present. That you turn to the people and they will select the pastor, essentially by vote. This is something similar that we see people doing in cities. In cities, almost everywhere, should I say the predominance of cities, we do have a city government, which is chosen by the guilds. And you get the people in the guilds voting for their guild masters, voting for the leaders of the guilds, and then they send these leaders to the city council, where the city council makes decisions. But you can see there's choice involved, there's democracy involved in this. This kind of doctrine, therefore, is going to be very pleasing to people who live in cities. While northern Germany's Lutheran, southern Germany's Catholic, along the rivers, the Rhine River primarily, where you have a lot of cities, Calvinism, we call this Reformed as well. Calvinism has a bigger impact because the doctrines are more appealing, a little bit more appealing anyway, to people living in a city. Many years ago, there was a flap. Maybe there's other flaps. I'm sure I'm completely out of the loop on all this by now. But there was this idea about life after death. And there were a number of books where people had been in hospitals usually, and had the doctor said, "You're gone, you're dead," for a certain length of time, number of minutes or whatever. And then they say, "I left my body." And some of them floated above the hospital bed, look down, look at the corpse. Some of them float off toward light, and they see lights. And they have these out-of-body experiences, and then they come back into their bodies. And now you're alive again. And your spirit's there, and now you can tell people about your experiences. I remember reading one of these back in the 70s. I was very entertained by it. Anyway, the man died and he floated away. He's going across the country as a spirit. And he's floating across, and he seemed to be directed by his belief system. He never said in the book, as I recall, what religion he was. But he didn't actually go into heaven, but he saw heaven. He's kind of out looking in. He's in there looking and seeing heaven. And it was a city. I'm going, well, I don't know his religion, but I bet he's Calvinist. Because in this case, he's seen what he has been taught to see, what he expects to see. Calvin writes a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Let me say that clearly. The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Very often when this is referred to, people just call it the Institutes. So you know if someone says the Institutes, it's really the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, John Calvin is an intellectual, much like Martin Luther. While Martin Luther's training is in theology, Calvin's training is in law. Lawyers have a tendency to like things systematized. They tend to like things that are quite clear. What Calvin does in the Institutes, he wrote and worked on this for decades. He would write this. Initially, the earlier versions were published in one volume. He keeps working on this. He keeps expanding this. Finally, the final product, he was actually working on it up to the time when he died. The final product is actually in 2 volumes, quite large. Very, very interesting. We call it the textbook or handbook. I use the term textbook, maybe handbook would work just as well, of Christian theology and practice. This tells you how to organize a meeting. This tells you how to run your organization. There are people that have different roles in the Christian community. You have the doctor, theologians, who are going to make sure they understand the Bible. They're going to make sure they understand the Institutes and can help explain that for people. The pastor is the teacher. Remember, he's a lot like a minister, which we see in Lutheranism, where he's up there expounding on the word of the Lord. If he's inspired, he will make sure the things he's expounding upon are doctrinally correct. There are other people that have jobs in the position, jobs in the congregation. There's the elder and there's the deacon. Many years ago, I was talking to a Protestant and telling me about his faith a little bit, which I thought was very interesting. I was quite flattered that he would explain a few things to me. He said they're going to make me a deacon. I'm not ready. He's in his 40s, right? I was thinking, well, you've been around the faith a long time. And he says, no, I'm not ready for that. That's a really big step. So these aren't things that come early in life. A lot of times they come later in life, where the community, the congregation, has known you for many years and can, shall we say, judge to a certain extent on your abilities. You can take the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which also is a statement of theology. You see, the issue, what part of the issue is here is Martin Luther is so prolific. Oh my goodness. In German, his works have been published like in 90 volumes. In English translation, I've seen 50 volumes of translation. For decades, this guy is averaging a tract, a pamphlet, like once every 2 weeks. And he's talking about all kinds of issues here. Some of them are religious, some of them are doctrine, some of them are social. He's not a systematizer. And sometimes he says things that are something of a contradiction. An example is this. He says when he's starting out with his teachings, I demand to be heard in front of the council of the church. I demand to say that a council of the church should hear me so I can explain things to Christendom so you'll all understand properly. In other places he says, The councils of the church have no validity. Now, wait a minute. If you want to be heard in a council, why on earth would you say councils are invalid and have no authority? See, isn't that at least a slight inherent contradiction? See, Calvin doesn't like this kind of thing. In the Institutes, he wants everything clear, including doctrine, including practice. This Institutes, this Handbook of the Christian Religion, you simply take this volume, or later on 2 volumes with you, and this happens in the United States, early colonies. You take these books with you, and you go to New England, and you open these things up and say, here's our doctrine, and here's how we practice and run a church. So the Institutes is a very practical guide. A little bit surprising to us, modern religions, modern Protestant religions, among others, do have a tendency to want to please people, be nice to your congregants. It's fascinating to me that John Calvin thought you could perfect a society by the use of force. Let's go back to Geneva, Protestant area. Yeah, he's influential in the city council, and therefore he gets his way in a lot of respects. Well, he gets the council to pass what we call blue laws. Maybe I'm using this slightly incorrectly. When I was growing up, blue laws usually meant Sunday closing laws. In my hometown, for example, I'm from Tooele. In my hometown, for example, when I was a kid, the city council says you don't open on Sunday. Why? Well, it's a religious statement, isn't it? Don't open on Sunday. Well, to a certain extent, people said, look, people are sick on Sunday. At least you should have a pharmacy, a drugstore open. So they would rotate Sunday by Sunday. This drugstore would be open this Sunday. This drugstore across the street would be open on the next Sunday. So you could come in and get your medications if you needed them. There were, still are probably, people who object to that kind of idea. I don't buy into your religious ideas of forcing people not to do something on Sunday. If I want to shop on Sunday, I should be allowed to shop on Sunday. And you should not tell me what to do. Of course, Calvin would not agree with that. You have to be forced. My goodness. Blue law Sunday closing laws would have been minor compared to the kinds of laws that are enacted in Geneva. I mean, you have to be a church. You better be there. And I know you got your kids are screaming, the baby's hungry. You got to be there. You got to be there even if the building's cold. You got to be there if you're hungry. You got to be there if the kids are unruly. You got to be there sometimes 4 hours. And it's equally fascinating to me that you want to force society. And it goes into clothing and conduct as well. But also very popular in Calvinist meetings is what we call the Jeremiad. There is a prophet in the Old Testament called Jeremiah. And Jeremiah wrote, among other things, a book called oh goodness, I had it and I lost it. The Lamentations, where he's saying, oh, everything's gone to pot. We've been invaded by other people. He's living in a cave because he can't get out in society. And he talks about all these people are doing bad things, and that's why bad things fall on society. So rather than going into a Calvinist meeting in this sense and hearing, you're great people, we really love you, and, keep on working for the religion, do all these kinds of things, what we're actually seeing in there, the pastors up there saying, you're all a bunch of scuzz. You are just awful. Why would God even care about you in your degraded life, in your sin? And you're listening to this for hours. And next week you come back again. Well, can we say to a certain extent that must have resonated with these people? Of course, when the city government is saying you're going to be there, maybe you better either change who's on the city council or you're going to have to go along with it. Well, perfecting society through force. Yes, this is true of not as, shall we say, quite as bad, but this is largely true of the New England Puritans when they came a few decades later to Massachusetts and other areas of New England. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the doctrinal differences. We say there's not a real major difference between Lutheran doctrine on salvation and Calvinism. They both believe that you are chosen for salvation by the Lord, or you are not. There's nothing you can do. Denial of free will. There's nothing you can do. There's no work that you can perform, even though you think it's a good, righteous work, that's going to have anything to do with your salvation. That really does not happen. One of the things that Luther does not directly address is, why are people lost? Well, clearly by implication. If you're not chosen for salvation, you got a problem. You're probably going to end up in some other place. But he doesn't really say what's happening there. What Calvin does is he doesn't back off from this. And sometimes we call this predestination and double predestination. Predestination is literally you are chosen from birth for salvation or damnation. Yes, you have to be baptized. But God would choose you to be in a situation to be baptized. And you are chosen for salvation, or you are chosen for damnation. Predestination, you're chosen for one direction. Double predestination, you're chosen for salvation, you're chosen for damnation. Once again, this is the justice of God. We cannot argue with his justice. We might not like it, but I'm sorry, that's the way it is. He's strong enough on this statement that he actually goes on to state or imply that we don't really have freedom of choice at all. Luther would essentially say, yeah, you should be nice anyway, even though it doesn't have anything to do with your salvation. In Calvinist ideas is you're actually not choosing to do what you think you're doing. For example, here I am. I like to gesture. I get nervous when I lecture. It takes away a little nervous energy. In watching effective speakers and teachers over the years, I've noticed that the people that I think are most effective are the ones that tend to be a little animated. So one time I was sitting on an art history course many years ago, and I swear the professor lady, she was up there, and she was like, she's running aerobics. She should have got PE credit for every lecture she gave. She's up there with the gestures. Man, this is art. I can't remember what she was saying now, but I thought she was very entertaining. That's a lot different than monotone droll, not saying anything, not doing anything. Well, I'm kind of a hands-moving guy anyway, so hopefully this works. You're probably a better judge of this than I am. But let me use that as a point of departure. I think I'm in control of my body. I think I raised my hand right there, or this hand, or I'm making gestures. And I think I chose to pull out this water, and I'll probably take a hit from it in a minute. I think I'm making those decisions, but I'm not. When I was born, the Lord made the decisions for me. These are not decisions I'm making. I'm just totally fooled. I think I'm making decisions, but I'm not. Can we say this is a little bit, I don't want to act like I'm criticizing, but this comes across to me, and maybe it's just my modern biases, this comes across to me as a little bit harsh. On the other hand, it's widely taught. There is a small problem here which I need to mention, and that is there is clearly a doctrine of sin, that people do things which are sinful. But if we do not have the choice to do what we think we're doing, we don't have the choice of action, maybe even thought, because that's mandated or predestined by the Lord, then in reality, who's the author of sin? It's the Lord, logically. This brilliant lawyer, this brilliant theologian, course, he was asked that. Rather than all of his arguments, his systemizing, his statements on doctrine, he did not actually address that as fully as perhaps we would expect. In fact, eventually what he says is, I'm sorry, that's just not so. Okay. Any event, as we look at the development of Protestant churches, I'm not saying that even churches that come from the Calvinist tradition are still hardline people as far as predestination and some of these doctrines are concerned. Over time, a few centuries, we see that people do want to have a say in their religion, a say in their salvation. I said that wrong. That these people in reality want to have their actions to be worth something. And because of that, we find that some of these Protestant religions soften these doctrines to a certain extent. Now, I already made a big deal about the fact that the Protestant Reformation is only successful where governments, cities, state governments support it. Can we say the most important state to become Protestant is England? Why would I say that? We have significant Protestant movements in northern Germany. We have significant Protestant movements in Denmark and Sweden, even Iceland, Norway. But these aren't major powers. Major powers, Spain. Remember Charles V? Spain, Austria, France remain Catholic. And as part of their disapproval of Lutheran doctrines, we find power base, large power base. They buy armies and they march, and we have wars of religion that go on for decades. Had it not been for England sending largely money, sometimes troops, but largely money, to support the Protestant Reformation in Holland and in northern Germany, it's very likely they would have not been able to hold on. It's very likely that the Catholic forces, being backed by Charles V and others, would be able to set back or crush Protestantism. Had it not been for the Reformation in England, it's likely, maybe even probable, that the Protestant Reformation would have been destroyed. So the Reformation is extremely important. And I've already mentioned that because England becomes Protestant, North America, United States, Canada are largely Protestant as well. So the impact, even in Australia and New Zealand, is very important. So let's take a look at what happens here. Of all the things I lecture about in the early part of this course, I think I see more understanding from my students in this area than any other. There's so many good stories here that I think that my students have already heard a lot of these. Please bear with me if I'm repeating myself. I'm not repeating myself. I'm repeating what you already know. But in many respects, I can talk about this and my students go, oh yeah, I know about that. Why is this such a good story? Well, to a certain extent, it's a soap opera. You know, who likes who's in love with whom, who wants to sleep with whom. That becomes extremely important in the Protestant Reformation. So it has interest on more than one level. Well, okay, the Protestant Reformation starts in Germany. The Luther's tracts are translated in English, and they're sent across the English Channel over to England, and they really have little impact. People aren't paying much attention. Why? Some of the factors involved that brought out Martin Luther and brought a lot of people to believe that the Catholic Church is being misdirected included church abuses, most prevalently the sale of indulgences. And as I mentioned earlier, England did not, the King of England did not allow indulgences to be sold in England. Therefore, this issue is not there. People do not care. If we looked on the face of that, of these Lutheran tracts, you'd say that, well, it's dead on arrival. Nothing will happen here. But other factors are involved that lead us toward Calvinism, I should say, toward Protestantism. The King of England at this time frame is Henry VIII. This man is quite a work of art. In reading a few biographies of Henry VIII, reading some books dealing with the Protestant Reformation in England, I remember one author who made an extremely strong statement. Usually when authors speak and write books, they try to be very careful on the kind of terms they use. You want to use academic terms. You want to use terms that carry an academic message. They're very strong. When you're writing your articles and books, I'm sure you're going to remember that. But this one author, he shocked me. He called Henry VIII a bloody monster. Now, I don't speak British English. I speak American English. But I've been told bloody is a very strong term, and that's not really an academic term. This guy is a pretty awful human being. He is. I mean, he kills people because he just doesn't like them. Let's come to that as we go along. He's a hard man to like. One of the interesting quirks of history. His father was Henry VII, King of England. Henry VIII had an older brother. His name was Arthur. Obviously, Arthur should inherit the throne because he's the oldest. Well, what should Henry do? The younger son. His dad wants him to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Archbishop of Canterbury is the most important single church leader in England. There's only two archbishoprics, York and Canterbury. And Canterbury is considered to be superior to the one in York. Could you imagine a man with his tastes, drinking, revelry, and women, being an archbishop? Whoa, we would have some really swinging times in England. However, his older brother has illnesses, somewhat sick, and he dies. So when Henry, what is he, about 18? When his brother dies, then he's now the heir to the throne. When his father dies, he becomes the King of England. Okay, look at the tracts. Remember I said one of the things that happened is that they translated the tracts from German into English. And among other things, Martin Luther attacked the 7 sacraments of the church. In reaction, Henry VIII wrote a book, a pamphlet, a tract, called In Defense of the 7 Sacraments. Remember, he was supposed to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he had been trained as a young man, a child, should we say, in theology. He knows what he's talking about. He publishes his tract, 1521, In Defense of the 7 Sacraments. In reward for that, the Pope in Rome gives him a title called the Defender of the Faith. An irony here. The defender of the faith in England is the one who breaks the faith and starts the church in a different direction. I'm a little bit surprised how much attention we in the United States pay to the royal family in England, in Britain now. We look at their coronation. We've had a few weddings. They're really, I guess, I have to admit, I'm interested. I watch some of these on TV. I didn't watch them live like 2 o'clock in the morning, but my brother and his wife did. So, yeah, we're paying attention. And I guess it's a lot of fun. In any event, at one time, the coronation, or shall I say, when Prince Charles was marrying Diana, was this back in the 80s? He when they presented him for the marriage, they read the titles of the royal family, Prince of Wales, going down the list. And they said, Defender of the Faith. Okay, they're still using it, though it's probably not as appropriate as perhaps it ought to be if you're going to continue using it. Just an aside, during the 100 Years' War in the Middle Ages, the English claimed that they were the proper kings of France. And they still, in this list of titles, they're still saying King of France. Well, I think the French might have something to say about that. Any event, Henry has what he considers to be a very bad problem. He married his brother's widow. His brother Arthur married Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon is a Spanish princess. And why would the King of England marry or the heir to the throne of England, marry a Spanish princess very high in the royal family? Well, one of the ways you had political alliances back in this time frame is to marry between families. The King of England and the King of Spain decided, well, if we have a marriage, our family gets together, we will cooperate better. Their arch rival of both of these nations happens to be France. So isn't it a natural alliance to support each other against the French? And to do this, let's marry. And of course, this couple will have children, and their children should have power and allegiance to both states. It makes certain sense. Now, Catherine was married to Arthur. Arthur dies. So Catherine is largely in limbo. She's living in England, what she got. However, and it's after Henry's father dies, he can choose to marry whom he wants to. He decides to follow up with this alliance. And so he marries his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. And apparently initially the marriage worked pretty well. She's somewhat older than he was. I think he was like 18. She was late 20s, something like 27. They got along fairly well, at least for a few years. And she is routinely pregnant, and they have problems with having children. Few babies are born. One son lived for a few months before he died. They have a daughter. Her name's Mary Tudor. We'll talk about her as we go along. She's kind of a sickly child. Well, people aged faster back then than they do now. If we look at, for example, our political leaders, we see a man or woman in their 50s and 60s, we go, that's not very old at all. Well, back then, if you made it into your 50s, you're beating the odds considerably. Even nowadays, a lot of our prominent politicians, as you all know, are people in their 70s. Until fairly recently, the oldest president we ever had was Dwight Eisenhower, who was president into his 60s, which is really quite rare. Now we have important politicians that are in their 70s, and they seem like they're physically and mentally able to perform their offices. So people age largely because of health, largely because of hygiene, largely because of the kinds of food you eat. They tend to age faster back then. Well, so Catherine of Aragon has this one child, and she's sickly. She might die at any time. We know she lived to be a lot longer than they expected. But now she's beyond the age of bearing children. What can Henry do? Well, can you have a daughter, even if Mary survives? Can you have a daughter that rule England? Quite frankly, Henry doesn't think that's going to work. Women are too weak. They won't get the support of the government. He was wrong in this because he had another daughter by the name of Elizabeth I, who's going to rule very effectively for a very lengthy period of time. But he doesn't know that. One thing I want to point out is that his family is the Tudor family. He's Henry Tudor. His father was Henry VII, also Henry Tudor. The Tudors are usurpers. Let me repeat that. What had happened in England in the 15th century, this is the 1400s, there was a civil war. We call it the Wars of the Roses, where the House of York and the House of Lancaster slugged it out, killing a very large percentage of family members. These people had a legitimate claim to the throne. However, when both these sides, York and Lancaster, had fought it out, there's not much left. And Henry takes an army from abroad into England, and he essentially picks up the pieces. A right of conquest is not a legitimate claim to the throne. Henry VIII is afraid that a daughter will not be able to effectively rule. And he also is afraid that this very questionable statement that his family are the royal family, that might come out and bite them as well. What can he do? Well, he knows he's fertile. He has illegitimate children. But he's got a wife who can't have children. It's over. And what can he do? Well, he wants to get rid of her. He can divorce her and get somebody else. How can you get a divorce? Remember, divorce in Catholicism is extremely challenging. If you're a king, in this case the King of England, you want a divorce, what you can do is you can go down to the Pope, send your emissaries down to the Pope, and you can get the Pope to grant you a dispensation. A little bribe, you bring a little money with you, that kind of thing, and then maybe the Pope owes you a favor. If the Pope wants to keep you on his side, maybe he will find reason to grant you this divorce. He sends his emissaries down Cardinal Wolsey. This is 1527. 1527 is a very challenging year for the papacy and for the city of Rome, because in the many wars going on in Italy, the armies of Charles V, remember, he's the Emperor of Germany, but he's also the King of Spain. He's Charles I in Spain. And his aunt is Catherine of Aragon. Because of the civil wars, the wars that are going on in Italy, his mercenary army, Charles V's mercenary army, has taken and sacked Rome, it's 1527, and actually placed the Pope himself virtually under house arrest. There's nothing that the Pope is going to do at that point to make Charles V angry. And Charles V does not want to have his aunt made into a woman, shall we say, an illegitimate woman is probably the incorrect term, make her into someone who is not properly married to somebody. There are words for this, a loose woman among others. There's not going to be a divorce. Well, all Catherine has to do is step down. There's pressure. Oh, yeah. Henry's not nice about this. He sends his men in. They take away some of her servants. She's not allowed freedom of operation, or she can't run around a lot. She has to live in essentially one area. She's not like she's in a dungeon with rats eating her toes, but she's kind of under house arrest. All she has to do is agree that her marriage to Henry was not legitimate, it's invalid. All she has to do is lie. And she will be able to live in comfort. Henry will have his divorce, be no problem. But she has too much integrity. She will not tell a lie. No matter how much pressure is put upon her, she will not tell a lie. A decision of one woman of character, makes an enormous difference in the Protestant Reformation, makes enormous difference in the spread of religion, makes enormous difference in the world today because she had integrity. What happens is this. Henry talks to his lawyers, and they say, well, Your Royal Highness, why don't you just declare yourself to be the head of the church and grant yourself a divorce? Okay, why not? Let's do that. So he rejects the fact that the Pope is the head of the church in England. He declares himself to be the head of the church. And declaring himself to be the head of the church, now he can do what he wants to about the divorce, and he divorces Catherine. Who does he want? Well, I would like to say he's in love with Anne Boleyn, but that's probably not true. He's got the hots for Anne Boleyn. There's a woman around, and she likes him. He likes her. Get a portrait of her up here. Let me refer to the gentleman in the audience. Is she worth a kingdom? Is she worth a religion? I'll let you judge that yourself. She was supposed to be very attractive woman. One of her sisters had an affair with Henry and had a child. And Henry just wants to go to bed with her. Why not? She says, nope, you're going to have to marry me first. An unreasonable woman, you're going to have to marry me first. I mean, he can rape her. Who's going to say he can't? That's no fun. Isn't it a lot more fun if she's willing? Something like 5 years he pursues her. She says, you're going to have to marry me. If we have any children and we're not married, that child is illegitimate. One of the reasons why Henry wants a divorce is to get in bed with Anne Boleyn. Finally, after all this effort, all his efforts to do what she wants him to do, she finally gives in. Well, she gets pregnant. And some people say, they were married in January, and the baby was born in September. Actually, some historians say the date September is very nice, counting 9 months up from January. In reality, the baby was probably born in June. So if the baby had been born in June when they were married in January, the baby was sired, shall we say, is that the right word, before they were married, so the child is illegitimate, so they have to push the date back to September. It's a girl. Henry wants a son. He wants a son badly. It's a healthy girl. She's later going to rule as Queen Elizabeth. She's a healthy girl. She's got red hair, attractive little baby. Well, okay, first time around, you got a girl. Well, how about second time around? She's young, he's young, no problem, have another baby. Maybe the next baby will be a boy. So she gets pregnant again. Well, Henry wanted her until he had her. When he had her, he no longer wanted her. He's got the roving eye. I already mentioned he has illegitimate children. He's got the roving eye. He's looking around. And his eye falls very easily on Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour she's an easy mark. She's following him over. She's not making a big statement. So he's going to have no problem getting her. But he's married to Anne Boleyn. Well, their marriage has already gone sour for a long time. Anne Boleyn is accusing him of having the roving eye. He clearly has. She accuses him of looking at Jane Seymour. He clearly has. There's arguments in the castle. They don't get along. She's pregnant again. And finally, we believe that she caught Jane Seymour sitting on Henry's lap. And she really threw a fit. Can we say a royal fit? She really threw a fit at that time frame. And the child she is bearing miscarriages. And the baby comes out, the baby's born dead. It's far enough along you can tell the gender of the baby. The baby was a boy. Henry says that supreme case of an egoist. This man believes that everything he does is right, and anything that doesn't work out for him is somebody else's fault. See, he accuses Anne Boleyn, you killed my son. You caused your own miscarriage. It's your fault. Whoa, now we've got vicious hatred. Well, what can he do? He wants to marry Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn didn't give him the son which he wanted. So he decides that, well, I mean, he could divorce her, sure, but he's already done that. Does that make you look a little bit bad? Divorce. How about take a different tack? They start accusing Anne Boleyn of sexual immorality. She's sleeping with everybody who's close to her. She's sleeping with the people who take care of the horses. She's sleeping with everybody, literally is within proximity of her. The big deal about this is treason against the crown. Because if you are sleeping with other people than the king, if you have a child, then who is the father? And if the child is from another person, that should be very questionable as to allowing that child to be part of the royal family or the part of the line of succession. In other words, can that person be king? So this is a very, very serious matter. They even accuse her of having sex with a brother. Talk about sick. Can we say the evidence for this is lacking? There are confessions which are coerced from men that are nearby. So Anne is accused of adultery. She's tried, convicted, and beheaded. Her crime is simply this: she no longer pleased the king. And that was enough to get her killed. Yeah, when historians call this man a bloody monster, they're spot on. That's exactly correct. Well, okay, Jane Seymour. Of course, when Anne is dead, he marries Jane Seymour. Like I say, she's an easy mark. She does get pregnant, and she does have a child. And the child will later, we got him down here, will later be Edward VI. Well, as you can see, she has the child and then she dies. If Henry was actually capable of loving anybody, he probably loved Jane Seymour. And apparently his mourning for her was not just putting on a show. He probably actually felt something for her. But now he's got the son that he wants. But look at what he has done. He's declared himself the head of the church. Yeah, he killed his wife. But can you get the nation to support his statement? In 1534, he wants to make sure that the nation has supported his taking control of the church. He goes to Parliament. Parliament, representative body of upper class people. It's not democracy. This is not lower class people voting. This is, one historian said, one thing you cannot call Parliament this time frame is a democratically elected body. Nonetheless, they do represent money people, lords and merchants, within the state of England. Henry is good at offering them something that they want. So they passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534. And everybody in England is going to have to accede to this, going to have to swear that they will follow the Act of Supremacy. It's quite remarkable in retrospect how little effort there was for people to stand up for the Catholic Church. Sir Thomas More, who had been the Prime Minister of England, one of the great humanist scholars in England, simply refused to say anything. I won't say anything. And he's tried for being silent. The case against him was probably fabricated. They simply bribed some people to give false testimony saying he had denied the act of supremacy, when probably he had not. Anyway, he's killed. Very, very few people actually stand up and allow themselves to be killed for the old faith. Well, we haven't really created a Protestant religion yet in England. The major reason for this is you just replace the head. Well, how about doctrinally? Having a New Testament in English would be very helpful. William Tyndale translated the New Testament into English. Now, there was an old English version that even goes back to the 14th century, the 1300s. And we have part of that existing in fragments. So there had been some effort to translate the Bible earlier. Can we say with the advent of the printing press, now that you can have Bibles floating all over, having this in the vernacular, something that you can read very easily, if you can read, is helpful. The Great Bible, which includes the Old and the New Testaments, is available in 1539 and is mandated by the king that this Bible in English will be available in every church building in England. Yeah, it's bolted to the lectern or near the lectern, because these are valuable. Even though there's a lot of them, you don't want thieves grabbing these things. It's not something you should literally pass around to people very easily. But if you can read, you simply go up there, get your candle, look down and read it. Also, because of the printing press, the New Testament is printed in large numbers, becomes more available. Okay, let's go back now and talk a little bit about the royal family. Let's talk about Edward VI. Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Sickly child. Has some problems. Now, he's actually a pretty bright guy. He's pretty good in understanding church doctrine. He learns languages. This was commonly done back then. They're not as good at mathematics and science as you and I are, as we are, I should say. I shouldn't include me in that discussion. But they are very, very good in knowing multiple languages. It's not uncommon for people who are involved in diplomacy, going various places, to know 7 or even 8 languages. So he's a smart little boy, but he has problems. He has this scabs on him. His hair falls out. There's a real possibility he's not going to live very long. And as you can see from his dates, he does not live a long time. The brother, or one of the brothers of Jane Seymour, happens to be Edward Seymour. Can we say he's influential? Yeah. And he's very much into Protestantism. So he works with Edward VI and influences him, shall we say, to teach or to introduce Protestant doctrines into the liturgy and teachings of the church. We're moving in the direction of Protestantism. Can we say one of the major steps is right here? Jane Seymour helping Edward VI along with his ideas of making the church more Protestant. So pushes Protestant teachings. Well, you can see Edward VI dies in 1753. Well, there's no male line left in the Tudor family, so we go to the female line. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. If we look at Mary Tudor's life, remember she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. If we look at her, and we do call her Bloody Mary, or Mary the First. As far as people that she killed, her father killed a lot more people than she did. What's different about her is she tended to kill people in the name of religion. She was raised a nice Catholic girl. And when she becomes queen, she's still Catholic. And she's trying to push back Protestantism. She's trying to get rid of it by bringing back Catholicism. She persecutes people. Some of the Protestant leaders in various places in England, they've got to get out of town. We call these Marian exiles. And they run down here to Geneva. Who's there but John Calvin? So they go down to Geneva and they get their faith directly from John Calvin himself. Can you say they're pretty doggone good in the knowledge? Yes, they are. When Mary dies a few years later, they come back, they bring back the Catholic, I should say the Calvinist doctrine with them. For about another century, it was believed in England that they are not really a separate church, that the Church of England and John Calvin's church in Geneva are the same church. Over time, they did go in enough different directions that they call themselves different faiths, but initially they consider themselves to be the same religion. Well, so the church in England is Calvinist. That, definitely, I've already mentioned that. Well, what happens to Mary? Mary, remember, she had health problems. And she doesn't marry until she's queen. There is a prince. He's not ruling yet. He'll later be Philip II of Spain. At this time, he's Prince Philip. And one of these arranged marriages between the royal family in Spain and the royal family in England. Spain is Catholic. Later Philip II is Catholic. And he goes over, and when he marries Mary, he's now the King of England. Doesn't like England. It's dark, it's dreary up there. He never learns to speak really good English. He doesn't communicate well. He doesn't like the people. Well, what's he there for? He's there to get her pregnant. All they have to do is get a child and raise that child to be Catholic. And when that child rules in England later on, England's Catholic again. So he does his duty. He doesn't like England, goes back and leaves her, goes back to Spain. Well, over time, Mary Tudor, her tummy gets kind of big. They say she's pregnant. Well, everybody knows how long it takes for babies to arrive. 9 months come, 10 months come, 11 months come. She has no baby. But her tummy kind of extends. I'm not a psychiatrist and I'm not a doctor. But I have read in one of the books say that she had a false pregnancy. It's the only time I've ever heard of this. She psychologically and emotionally so badly wanted to be pregnant that her body actually took on aspects of pregnancy even though she's not pregnant. There is no child. She dies. She dies without a child. Well, who's left? Elizabeth I. Remember Elizabeth I? She was the baby that was born to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Initially they said she was illegitimate because Anne Boleyn was sleeping around. However, you go back to Parliament, and Parliament says, sure, Queenie, let's legitimize you. She was raised Protestant, except there's a big problem. They believe she's Protestant. And her sister reigned for what? About 5 years. If she starts acting Protestant, they'll kill her because she becomes a threat to the throne, a threat to Catholicism. So Elizabeth gets to act as Catholic as she possibly can. She goes to Mass. She has a priest where she hears confessions. They still don't trust her, but she's going through absolutely all the actions of being Catholic. This helps us understand a lot about what she was like. As an adult woman, when her sister dies, her half-sister dies, and she becomes queen. One, paranoid and messed up lady, but extremely shrewd. She knows how to hide her ideas. She knows how to play people off against each other. She's one of the most revered and respected monarchs that England's ever had. Well, I've already mentioned this, so let me come back. Second Reformation, I've already mentioned this, 17th century, early 1600s, where there's an explosion of religions in England. I don't have a good explanation for this other than all kinds of groups of people are reading the Bible saying, my goodness, this is I can look at things differently. Many religions, some of the contemporaries said, there's like 29 of these things floating around out here. Another contemporary said, it's probably 180. I'd like to think these are exaggerated, but there's an awful lot going on. The Baptists, Quakers, also known as Society of Friends, basically Calvinists, and I've already mentioned this, many of these come to America. Before I get off of Elizabeth entirely, let me talk just a little bit more about her as a person. She decided never to marry. One of the reasons for that is she might have been afraid of pregnancy. Many women do die in childbirth. Another reason is that she was afraid if she married somebody, that if that person would be technically the King of England, though she would actually be ruling, but he would have a lot of power. If he had a lot of power, maybe he could subvert her power. Remember, she's a paranoid lady. She doesn't really want to trust anybody. She has a boyfriend, I think his name was Dudley. They were friends for years and years and years. He kept on trying to get her to marry, and she says, nah. And but she was probably deeply in love with him. She likes to kiss it up. She likes to make out. She would do these kind of things, little touchy feely, little kissy kiss in public. And of course, the people in court are a little embarrassed. Would your Royal Highness like to get a room to be private? Well, no, she doesn't. Well, why? Because if she smooches it up in private, no one knows how far it went. And people can claim that she's done some immorality and therefore she's not what she should be. She's not the Virgin Queen. And she thinks this is something that will actually hurt her as far as her power is concerned. So making out in public is probably a pretty good idea because people know how far it goes. She's so shrewd. People come to her and say, Your Royal Highness, you have to make decisions. She says, oh, I can't make up my mind. They say, oh, this silly old woman. She can't even think things through. Well, she, more than the people who have a tendency to give her advice, her advisors, she understands that some issues can be resolved by simply waiting them out. Time will actually resolve them. We don't have to take action. She's shrewd enough to realize this in many circumstances. There's the Second Reformation going on, and also there are some fundamentalist people in the Church of England, which are called Puritans. They are interpreting what's going on a little differently. She could have been pretty high-handed and pushed them around or even made sure they no longer existed. On the other hand, she has more subtle means of using force or pressure. So she's actually able to control them, at least as far as their political ideas are concerned, by not being as forceful. This is genius as far as ruling is concerned. She believes in low taxes. Yeah, she sends money to the Protestants who are fighting against the Catholics in Germany and Holland. But she doesn't want to build up this large army that's going to cost her so much money. She believes by ruling well, people will like her better if she keeps taxation relatively low. She's highly effective. She goes to Parliament rather than ruling essentially by her own dictates. She goes to Parliament, she negotiates with Parliament. Parliament loves her because they get along very well. This is a great ruler. Can I say one thing about her? She got smallpox. Didn't kill her, but it just did disfigure her. And when she did so, she had scars on her face. She's a vain woman. And to cover up her scars, she wore very heavy makeup. In fact, some of her hair fell out because of the smallpox, so she wore these wigs. She was a red-headed woman, so she wore red-headed wigs. They think by the time she was fairly old along in her reign, that in effect, her makeup was so thick it could have been like an inch deep. She wants to look good. Uh, can we say that goes a little bit to her paranoia? When she was younger, she didn't have so many situations with that. Okay, talked about a very effective ruler. Um, things do change, of course, after she dies in 1603, which is something we will allude to later on. However, I've been talking about the Reformation. And one thing I have really not got into very much at all, and that is the Counter-Reformation. What I really have not said is that what was the Catholic Church doing at the same time? We study the Protestant Reformation to understand what the Protestants are doing. Well, we have to understand the Counter-Reformation in order to understand what the Catholics are doing. When I was a student at the Catholic University of America back in the 1970s in Washington, D.C., I had a little private chat with one of the professors. Fun thing to do. Really like to hear what the ideas these people have. And somehow we mentioned the Protestant Reformation. And he said, as Catholic scholars, we are still not sure if that was a good or bad thing. He explained it this way. We can look at it as bad because it broke up Christendom. It creates Protestantism, which leaves the Catholic matrix. On the other hand, he says, it got the Catholics to clean up their act. And that's a good thing. Okay, very interesting observation. Well, Protestantism is around for a few decades before the Catholics actually take an awful lot of careful examination. Initially, the Pope says, he does send Cardinal Cajetan up to try to intimidate Martin Luther. But largely, the Pope is interested in other things. He's interested in building the Vatican. He kind of looks at this initially as a squabble among monks up in northern Germany. Does not react early on. So can we say the church allows this to get a foothold before they actually react? When the church matrix starts paying attention, the Protestantism had already been around for a few decades. Well, one of the ideas of Protestantism was to state that we're preaching now the correct faith. In reality, what we should be able to create, the ideal society. And however, this does not really happen. Do we actually see these areas in the cities and in the countryside becoming the ideal Christian communities? That would be a very hard argument. In fact, that really doesn't happen. So when you start looking at that, there is an opportunity for Catholics, shall we say, to come in and say, if they haven't been successful in creating these ideal societies, maybe there's a weakness. We can actually take the reaction, sometimes it's called the Catholic Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reform. But we see two basic aspects of this: piety and mysticism. Piety is a nice word for morality. Can we say one of the strengths of the Catholic Church is its morality? One of the strengths of the Catholic Church is to be able to do good to people? Yeah. What happens when you destroy the Catholic Church in many communities around Europe? The entire matrix, the pious parish priest, the nuns of mercy, the money that goes to charity, all that's disappeared. And some people look around saying, maybe some of that should come back. Piety is part of this. Piety means you have emphasis in morality, being kind, being decent. Mysticism is another term. Mystic is a person who has an intimate and personal union with the Lord. It's, can we say, it's the influence of the Spirit on the person that enlivens you to be a better person, that brings you great joy and comfort. One of the fascinating things about this is, it seems like, as we look at Catholicism, as you know, is a very old religion. And there are various times when the faith has a certain numbers of problems. And when you have crises in the church, it seems like almost always there are some people, these are grassroots movements. You don't have the Pope standing up saying, well, we're going to have a new saint in Spain. Now, that really doesn't happen. We find people within the entirety of the church starting by themselves, literally to put emphasis on the kinds of things that the church does best. One of the things we tend to see from these time frames, we see new religious orders. We see new monastic groups. We see new groups of nuns who tend to bring the religion back to the people. Let me talk a little bit now about doctrine. Protestantism has a doctrine which I hope I've explained fairly clearly. Does that mean that the Catholics aren't arguing for their doctrine? We left Erasmus a long time ago. Remember, Erasmus was a Christian humanist. Remember the Novum Testamentum, 1516, which allowed to have authoritative Greek New Testament available to people. His impact is quite impressive. When the Protestant Reformation comes out, literally starting the next year in 1517, Luther's tracts are being passed around. And Erasmus, people want Erasmus to comment. He wants Erasmus, the people want Erasmus to come out. And he dodges this for quite a while, actually. What he says is this. Well, I haven't really read these. And he says I don't read German. Well, we have letters from him that are in German. He could read German. He could write German. He's dodging this. Can we say to a certain extent, therefore, because he's backing off, that he least wants Luther to have a say? In fact, he said this. Let's hear what he has to say. Erasmus probably agreed with some things which Luther was talking about. But finally, when it came to free will, your ability to make a decision for your salvation or not for your salvation. And Erasmus has read the New Testament, and he writes a tract called Diatribe on Free Will, published in 1524. It's a very well-reasoned argument. It's quite academic in its approach. He starts out by defining his terms, starts out by saying, this is what I'm going to mean by this. And he very, shall we say meekly, not a lot of venom in his pen, he comes out and very meekly says, well, aren't there some scriptures here that would tend to disagree with Luther's theology? And there's one from this, two versions of this in Matthew 23 and 37, Luke 13 and 34. Jesus is talking to the people in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen protects her chicks beneath her wings, but you would not let me. See, Jesus wants to save these people, but they won't let him because they have to do something. Isn't this at least a small contradiction? A major contradiction to what Martin Luther sang? Let's go to Matthew 7 and 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. He who does the will. You can't just say, Lord, Lord. You have to do something. Matthew 16 and 27. He will reward each person according to what he has done. 2 Corinthians 5 and 10. These are quotes that Erasmus used. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Everyone, get down here if I can, everyone may receive the things done in his body according to what he has done, with either good or bad. So you can choose to be good or bad. James 2 and 17, faith by itself, it does not have works, is dead. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that I was taking the investigator course down at Lutheran Church several decades ago. I'm trying to be very nice, but I would like an answer to some questions I have. I asked the pastor, in fact, I used this scripture and said, well, doesn't it appear that he's saying that you have to do something? The pastor gave me a very good answer. He put it this way. He said, yes, he appears to be saying that. by saying he appears to be saying that doesn't mean it's clear that he's saying that. But he came back with what I consider to be very, very good answer. He said, every religion takes certain scriptures in the Bible, and they take these scriptures and they use them to define or understand other scriptures. Bingo. If you're Catholic, you look at this and say, this supports my ideas of Catholicism. If you're a Protestant, you look at other scriptures. Remember, I quoted a few of those when we were talking about Martin Luther. So there's these other scriptures that tend to support his ideas. So I guess we're back to the discussion. If you're Catholic, you view it, these scriptures are very, very important. If you're not Catholic, you tend to look at other scriptures by which you interpret the Bible. Luther wrote a tract right after this saying, oh, Erasmus, why do you make all these arguments? Just, I'm right, just admit it. Well, he didn't admit it. It's quite fascinating about looking at Erasmus. Erasmus initially was rejected by the Protestants because he essentially didn't follow some of the doctrines. The Catholics also rejected him because he didn't come out forcefully enough and early enough to defend their position. However, over time, both the Protestants say, oh, he's really one of us. And the Catholics say, oh, he's really one of us. So his interpretation has gone back and forth somewhat. He did remain a Catholic. And he said, the church will abide in me, I'll abide in my church. Well, thank you for your patience. Thank you for being with me. We are not quite done with the Counter-Reformation, though I won't have to spend a lot of time with the remainder of that. And then we'll talk about the witch craze, and we'll do that next time. In the meantime, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, enjoy it.